20th in total. So before we start, I want to thank you, all of my guests and the audience, for letting me continue doing this webcast series. Today, we are going to talk about application delivery on Azure and A/B testing with a very special guest. And I am very excited to have her here today, April Edwards, with us today. April, welcome. How are you?
Thank you, Mert. Wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, you are welcome. So before we start, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is April Edwards. I work at Microsoft. I'm a senior software engineer in the commercial software engineering department. And what that really means is I'm built with code with customers. So I'm out there deploying code with our customers into Azure. So we do a lot of transformation projects with customers that will be breaking edges into Azure, trying to solve a lot of hard technical issues. So I'm out there day in, day out, deploying code with our customers and making things go well into Azure.
Okay, great. So today we are going to talk about application delivery and A/B testing, but I want to start with a basic question. What's an application delivery?
So application delivery, I mean, we think about, all of our organizations have, whether you're, a dev or an ops person, we talk about this, delivering something to our organizations. And whether you're a developer or operations, we have this kind of phrase that we use in the world called DevOps, right? And we want to talk about DevOps for just a second. Okay. I want to define DevOps. So Mert, if I were to ask you to define DevOps, what would you say? How would you define it?
To be honest, I am using this definition from Delvin Brown.
Good.
Because I don't like the DevOps culture stuff. This is the definition I am using.
Awesome. That's good to hear. I hear that more and more these days because people are listening, which is fantastic. But I think for each and every one of you out there listening, if I were to ask you to define DevOps, we all have different experiences and we all have a different way to define it. And I want to start with the working definition that Mert and I are very well used to working in. And we define DevOps as the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. So this is going to tie into application delivery. When we're writing code or we're deploying some kind of infrastructure, we need to be delivering value. And what is that value? And we need to do that as a team working together, and we need to iterate that process. And we need to find ways to make that better. And application delivery is going to be how we deliver that and ways we can introduce that. So we are going to talk more on the tooling side today of DevOps. And we're going to be focusing on some cool tools to allow us to deliver our applications and hopefully teach everyone here something a little new of how we do it in Azure and another way to do it.
Okay, thank you. So how can I set up an application delivery on Azure? So maybe
sure.
Azure DevOps?
So we're going to do that today, and I want to kind of go over the different types of deployment strategies that we have in Azure that you can leverage. So a lot of people out there today, think about when you're deploying an application, and maybe in your organization, you're doing it once or twice a year, and it's a big deal. So, it's all hands on deck, and you have to block out the weekend, and probably Monday and Tuesday are really going to stink because it's all going to fall apart. But it's a big monolithic push. You're making a lot of changes at once. And what happens is everyone dreads it and it never goes well. And something always breaks because there's so many unknowns. So when we look at deployment strategies, we want to do early and often. We want to be in our DevOps mindset. We want to look at a better way to do this. So in Azure, we can leverage the cloud to do a lot of this for us. And we can do a lot of this on premises as well. And the tooling we're going to use today, you can use on premises, you can use in Azure, and you can use to any other cloud. So this won't just be specific to Azure, but I work in Azure, so I'm a bit biased. So the first type of deployment we have is a rolling deployment. And this is where we slowly introduce a new version of code, and we gradually increase those instances across our environments. And the old code gets phased out because the new code is working, hopefully. Now, the benefit here is that we can stop and roll back. So if we roll out some code to maybe one environment, it breaks, we can roll that back. Or maybe we get to the next environment, it breaks, we pull that back. An example could be maybe a deployment with Kubernetes or multiple instances of a website that you might have load balanced and use the load balancer to deploy that website out. But it is gradually rolled out over time, and you can roll that back. And that's what's really good about a rolling deployment. Another type of deployment that we can do, and we're not going to touch on as much today, but it's kind of like an A/B deployment, but that's our blue-green deployment. And the blue-green is where you have two separate environments that are identical. Now, the blue-green deployment's tough because very rarely in our organizations do we get two identical environments, much less three. So when we talk about running like dev test, pre-prod and prod, a lot of times we're using lesser hardware. Maybe the OSs aren't patched as much. Blue-green assumes you have literally two different environments that are absolutely identical. So we have production environment that could be our green environment. We roll out our code changes to that blue environment, and that's completely separate, so it doesn't affect green. We monitor for that for stability, we run our tests on it, and then we cut over to the new environment, which was blue and becomes our new green, and then the old green environment becomes our new blue. So then we can patch and update that, and then maybe do the new updates onto that environment. So green is the new blue, blue is the new green, and green is the new blue. And you can redirect back to blue if green fails or there's an issue. The problem is it's a pretty hard cutover. So there's some disadvantages to that. The next one I want to talk about is a Canary deployment. So Canary deployments are similar to what we're doing today. We're going to use a mix of a Canary deployment with our A/B deployment today. But effectively, we're deploying a new version of our code into production, and we're going to shift our traffic to that example. So a really good example of that is using an Azure web app. And we can use deployment slots. So we can change the amount of traffic going to that slot. And I'm going to show everyone that in a few minutes. And a really cool feature that we can do with Azure DevOps is enabling something called feature flags. Feature flags are great because we can write our code, we can deploy it. We can deploy it to VIP users like ourselves, and maybe a couple execs in the org that really want to test the newest, latest, and greatest stuff. And then when it gets approved, it then goes to the next ring, which might be all the IT department, maybe a few other select departments in the organization. And then when that gets approved and the feedback's been really positive, you roll out to maybe a site. Maybe it's a site here in the UK. Who knows, right? And that feature flag is enabled. And then you go maybe next to maybe UK wide. And that's the next ring in your feature set. And if there's a problem as you roll that feature out UK wide, you turn off that feature flag and it automatically pulls those changes back. So there's no effect on the infrastructure, there's no effect on the people, and you can make those changes pretty quickly on the fly. So any questions, Mert, about any of those deployment strategies or anything else coming from anyone watching from home?
I have another question related to deployments. So when I Googling the application delivery on Azure, I have seen a topic, Azure Application Delivery Suite. Is that a different product?
So we have started to come out with new products that make it easier for people to achieve this when they come to the cloud. Because the big thing when you come to the cloud is there's so much going on, right? There's all sorts of features built into each of the products you're consuming. You have things like security features, and we're constantly rolling out changes to our products. So we're constantly trying to rebrand those things and add features in so that when you're buying a product or a resource in Azure, you're not just buying a virtual machine, you're buying a lot more behind that. So yeah, they've started rolling out a lot more project of those potentials, especially with the testing capability. Yes.
Okay, as you say testing, I want to ask you about our topic. What's an A/B testing?
So A/B testing today is going to be, we're going to have two versions of our website, and we're going to redirect our traffic effectively. So let me give you an example. So a lot of us have probably come into this kind of real life example. So we're going to run a website. We are running a website. We're all part of Tailwind Traders. So we're going to make these changes together today. And basically what's happened is we've been approached by our marketing team, and our marketing team goes, you know what? We want to make some changes to our website, and we have a bank holiday weekend coming up. And we're like, okay, so the business wants to get some hard metrics as to if they change the shipping threshold from $100 to, let's say, $250, will that encourage buyers to spend more? Or does it not have an effect on their buying behavior? So the bank holiday weekend's coming up. They know that's when sales are going to increase. So this is the perfect time. So this is effectively a Thursday, and ironically enough, it is Thursday. It tends to be Thursday every time I give this demo, so it actually works out really well. And so it is Thursday. They need this change by, as you guess, by tomorrow, because we have an upcoming bank holiday weekend this weekend, in theory. So how would you look to do this, Mert, or how would you think to do this?
Maybe I can use staging.
Yeah, absolutely. So the good news is this is built on an Azure web app. So we have some features built in, but I want to automate this whole process as well, because I can make a manual change, but I want to automate it and have full visibility of my code check-in. I also want to know that if we have a change, when it's been made, and I want to deploy it into a pipeline, because actually this website's running in a staging environment and a production environment. So if I go to our staging environment up here, it's also $100. Okay. So our staging and production are identical environments. And I want to change staging first, really. So what I'm going to do first and foremost is I'm going to change our code. Okay. So this is the code for the front page of our website. I want to change that threshold very simply. $250. I'm going to do exactly what that marketing team has said they wanted to do. I'm going to check in those changes. And I'm going to go shipping change. And I always tell people, make sure your comments fit what code submission you're doing so that you know what changes you made and can trace them back. So I'm going to push my changes to GitHub, because all our code sitting in GitHub, we're a very DevOps organization. We have all our code in one place. I should see a code commit coming through 16 seconds ago, right? So I've made that shipping change for the bank holiday weekend. I can see exactly what that change was, full traceability in my team. Now, my code sits in GitHub, but actually I can go to the marketplace and hook this into our Azure DevOps pipeline. So if we go in and type in Azure Pipelines into the marketplace, we have the Azure Pipelines add-in. So I've already configured access to authenticate to my Active Directory. To my Azure DevOps through my Active Directory. So it is running. It should be running in. Yep, it's already set up. We're good to go. Cool. So it's already configured. I just want to configure the access, make sure it's set up. I'm just going to connect that through. And what it's doing is it tells me what this is going to do. So I've installed this a couple months ago. This was developed by Microsoft. It hooks into GitHub. And it just allows us to keep our code in GitHub, because that's where it is. That's an organization where we like to keep it. But it gives it access to get access to this website here. So I'm just going to add my repository. So I could give it access to all my repositories in my Azure DevOps instance. But actually, I want to give it very specifically to where my project's running. So I just need to find it. And you can tell I probably have way too many projects running, but that's okay. So I tell it to save, and it's authenticating through. So this is all using Active Directory on my back end. And it's going to go through my Azure DevOps and say, right, we're going to load this in. And what it's going to do is I can choose which organization. So I do have a lot of Azure DevOps organizations. I'm going to select a project. I'm actually going to select an existing project for this. Let me make sure I pick the right one first. So we've already had a project set up by our project team. So kind of everything's there, right? I want to authorize everything. Let's continue. We're doing this from scratch. I'm doing this on the fly. So for everyone out there watching, this is from Greenfield. So hopefully it all works. So again, select my repository. Now what it's doing is it's reading my code in GitHub, and it actually sees these different configurations, these different bits of code in my GitHub repo. And why this is really cool is that if you're starting from scratch and you haven't worked a lot in YAML and you want to configure a pipeline, you could say, I get Node.js in my code. I'm going to push that. Or I have a Xamarin app, and it will start building these features out in the pipeline. But I already have an existing YAML file, so I want to use that. Oops. It actually wrote a YAML file for me. It just gave me a really basic hello world YAML file. But in my code, my team was really nice and gave me a YAML file that we need to use. Now, this YAML file is going to have things like, what versions of agents to run my testing on, et cetera. So if I want to run on like Ubuntu machines or Windows machines, or I need to run on a Mac OS, et cetera, I can do that. So let's cut that in there. So this YAML file is going to write my pipeline. This is defining it for us. It's going to run a build job. It's running it on the Windows VM because I want to test against the Windows VM because that's how my code's running. It's running some NuGet commands, and it's going to build this. And, we can add some tests to this. We can do all sorts of great things. And it's running a test in my code. It's going to copy the files, and it's going to give us a build artifact. So it's going to run. So we're going to set up this initial pipeline here. We're going to save it and run it. And it is going to run us a pipeline on the fly. Now, this is all dependent on my internet and the nice demo gods taking care of us today. So we'll give this a second and let it run through. So it's creating our pipeline. I already had a YAML pre-configured, but you can easily use the YAML editor and get it going. So this is going to run our build of our code we've submitted. So it's that $250 change, $250 change is going to run through all that YAML file here for us. So while it's doing that, as it runs that build, runs our tests against our code to make sure it's going to work, and we've ran our unit tests and everything's okay. We then want to release it into our environment. So as you said, Mert, we want to run it into Canary. So I'm going to start a new pipeline. Okay. And I told you before we had two environments. So as we start a new pipeline here, we have this option to run anything. If you're running, you can see here we have Kubernetes clusters here. If you're running even an on-premises IIS website and SQL database deployment, you can run that to an on-premises server or even virtual machines in Azure. But we are running an app service deployment. So I'm going to select that, hit apply. So for this first stage, I want to call this Canary. And you may ask, where's your Canary environment? So if I go up to my Tailwind Traders website here, staging, not Canary. My bad. So we're going to test everything in our staging environment first. So if I go to my staging environment, in my Tailwind Traders Azure portal, I have a website here. This is the exact one I showed you here, $100 for shipping, no changes. This is an Azure web app. I can see, how it's working. And that's where I want to make our changes to first. So let's go in here. Now we can see the little stage tasks here haven't been filled out. So what this will do is, and again, this is the classic editor. So we can do this all in YAML. So where I did the build a moment ago, and it's building as we speak, I could absolutely do the whole release from the same YAML. But to kind of have that visual reference of what we're doing, I want to use this because it's a little bit more picture oriented. And it's a lot easier for everyone to see. And YAML can be a bit of a pain to deploy the first time if you haven't. So I've told it to authenticate to my internal subscription, which is where I'm running it from. And it asked me what kind of application I'm running. So this is running on Windows, but we have the option to run this on Linux, on containers, or in a function app. We have those options, but I know it's running on a web app on Windows. And because it's authenticated to my Azure subscription, it sees the staging website, Tailwind Trader Staging, which is awesome. It's already authenticated through AD's doing the handshake, and that's good to go. So as I fill this out up here in the deploy for app service, I can go change some more settings. So I'm showing you the classic editor, but we can do this with YAML. So if I hit view YAML here, this will spill out my YAML. So for those of you that are learning YAML or want to learn how to use YAML, you can build out these things and pull out the steps like this. So I could do this in the reverse way and start writing the YAML. The other thing you can do is as you start writing your pipeline, there's a marketplace thing on the side for every task you want to do, and it will spit out the YAML. So it still gives you configuration just like we're seeing, and it spits out the full YAML for you. So it's really, really handy. So I'm just going to go over our settings here. So it is pulling everything through. I'm happy with it. It's pulling through the staging environment. Yeah, I'm happy with that, and I can save that. So I save that step. Go back to my pipeline, and we have a staging environment. Now, I want to run tests on my staging, but I want to deploy it to another environment. Now, Mert, would you deploy this from staging directly to production?
I don't think so.
Right, because there's a bit of a risk. So this is where our A/B deployment strategy is going to come into play, and this is really leveraging Azure. So we have a production environment. But if we go straight from staging to production, there might be more testing, but that means we're changing production. And we really want to compare that $100 shipping threshold to $250 shipping threshold. So this is where we're going to leverage deployment slots. Deployment slots are one of my favorite features of web apps, and they are included. So I have an app service plan that allows me up to 5 deployment slots. Okay. So I've actually already created the slot here because my ability to type and talk is not great, but effectively we just add the slot. So I can call this one Mert's staging, and it gives us a name, Tailwind Traders -production and Mert staging.azurewebsites.net. I can clone the exact same settings from production and put in the slot. So effectively what we're doing is a like for like configuration that's in production, and we're giving another slot. And we can use these slots to divert our traffic to our website. And I'll show you in just a second. So this is creating the new slot for us. Again, it's identical to what's in production. There are no changes. So all the configuration is there. All right, that's successfully created. So I can click on this slot here. And if I click on it here, everything comes up. It gives us that URL. So it tags it with Tailwind Traders -production Mert staging.azurewebsites.net. Now, we can add a custom DNS name to this. So we don't have the .azurewebsites.net. So don't worry about that for people watching. I want to open up this website. Now, again, I'm doing this on the fly with everyone. Oh, should open up now. It's up and running. Okay, so it takes a minute to get the code up. We'll give it a second. I'm being a little bit impatient, but effectively, I'll go back to our staging slots here. Our deployment slot, sorry. If I click on the Canary that I've already created and click on it, we have an identical website, okay, to production. So our production website's here, $100 or more, and our Canary is here. It's pretty much impossible for us to differentiate production from Canary. So that's great. We have literally identical environments. Let's see if Mert staging is up now. I do want to see if it does come up. It does take a couple minutes to get the actual website running. That's okay. It's still hanging out and waiting. That's absolutely fine. So we'll let that run and build itself. But effectively, we've just made another production environment with the identical settings, which, again, when we talk about deployment strategies, we want that identical configuration. We want the same workload being tested against what's real life. So the other thing I'm going to do real quickly before I change is I'm going to divert 50% of our traffic. Okay, this is our A/B testing at heart. So this is something that anyone can do that has a web app. You can go in, create this deployment slot, and a web app has a load balancer on the front of it. You can create, and with this plan I'm running, I can create up to 5. So I could effectively put 25 over here, 25 to Mert slot, 25 to Mert slot, 25 to my Canary, and 50 to production. I could really mix and match it if I wanted to. If I could run 3 different versions of my website. But what this means is the Azure Web App Load Balancer is going to divert our traffic 50-50. So half our users are going to see production, half are going to see Canary, but we're going to test it first in staging. Are you with me, Mert?
Yeah. Are there any recommended values for redirected traffic?
Sorry?
Are there any recommended values for this? For example, you entered 50-50.
So I entered.
Recommended?
There's no recommended, it's preference. So I'm doing 50-50 because in this use case, I want to compare the shipping thresholds. So it's all down to business case. So I've worked with customers that have done 25%, 25% because they're testing features. But this is a free way to build out another environment. So okay. I do see a lot of people use 50-50 when they're testing that new feature. So our release pipeline, we have staging, okay? So we know that whatever we deploy to the staging environment is going to go to staging. Now, like we talked about, I want to add what's called a post-deployment condition, okay, Mert? So that means that when I deploy to staging, it's just not going to go deploy. I can run some manual and visual checks. I can add in users here for the testing. So I'm going to add in my name, I'll approve it. And probably best practices, you're not adding yourself, but for sake of this, I can add a timeout here. Again, there's a great tick box here for security where we can say the user requesting a release or deployment should not approve it. And we could do revalidation. So this post-deployment condition is going to be really handy. It will stop us. It's a manual check. It's going to stop us from going to the next environment. I want to add a gate. Okay, so you can add all sorts of different types of gates. It's basically an evaluation. You basically allow a delay before it starts evaluating your code. This is really critical, and I like this feature a lot because customers say to us, well, how do we run policy against it? How do we do other things? A post-deployment condition, adding a gate is a great way to do this. So we're not going to do anything too crazy with this, but you could run Azure policy. So if your organization has to run policies against it, we can invoke a function, call a REST API. Azure Monitor is, a great way to test how our staging environment's working. So maybe we want to query Azure Monitor and see, actually, we've ran our code. Granted, this is a really small change, but does it have performance effects in our environment? So we can query that. We can query work items. So we can see if there's any open work items in Azure DevOps that maybe we left open, or bugs or something we left. So these are really cool features that are at a bit of a manual check, but it allows us to invoke other things. The other thing we can do here is we can do an auto redeploy. So maybe there's a failure to this stage. Maybe something happened. We can redeploy to the last successful deployment. That makes sure that whatever failed, we can look into, create a bug for, and fix. So these are all measures that enable us. They really prevent us from making mistakes, right, Mert? Because we all make mistakes in our code. Unfortunate, but it's true. So now that we have the staging there, I actually want to add another environment. We're going to do another app service deployment. This is going to be our Canary environment. And very similar to the last one, we're going to set this up for our subscription. We could cross subscriptions. We could, again, do it to a different web app. We could go to a different app service. Now, this is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to deploy to our production environment for Canary. But then here, I can granularize this. And we have a great feature here, deploy to slot or app service environment. So if I have, again, multiple app services, I can do that. So I do need to check the resource group it's deploying to. And it will see my slots. I can see Mert staging environment, and I can see Canary. I am going to use the Canary environment just to keep true to the naming conventions here. And then, yeah, we're good to go. So the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to deploy to Canary. I can do a task maybe after Canary. I can do something in parallel. So I could run some other tasks along that stage. It doesn't just have to be straight to production. So being able to run things in parallel is really, really helpful. But for this use case, we're just going to run straight to the app service. You can also clone your stages. The only thing I found a little bit of a weird bug is when I clone my stage, I can't seem to change the deployment slot. So we're going to avoid that for the moment. And again, this slot here, we're going to make sure we're going into production. So that's good to go. Cool. So I'm going to add one more task in because actually, I'm not sure I want this going to production just yet. So we had post-deployment conditions. We have pre-deployment conditions. And these things can be triggered by after release. They can be manual. But I want, after Canary completes, I want to run this post-deployment. And I can change it. I could add it after staging even, but I'm just going to add it after Canary, keep it there. And I could do this on a schedule. I could say, this is going to run for this many hours after these deployments. So maybe that keeps us from, maybe someone deploys some code and it passes all the checks, but maybe doesn't go into production until our working hours or a very set time when we can monitor it and revert the changes. I can do it on pull request deployment. And again, you can do it based off gating and everything else again. So we still have those options. So I do have it after a stage. I am going to keep it, again, to a manual user approval because I want to make sure that I don't screw up my own code. But again, I'd usually make this a team of people for this manual check. So while this is running, we have a pretty solid pipeline. Are you happy with it, Mert?
Yeah.
Cool. So let's go to our pipeline environment here. So we have set up this new pipeline. It's ran successfully. It ran for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. So let's see what it did. So it's ran the build job. It was successful. It initialized the job. It checked out our code. It ran the NuGet installer. We used Node. We ran a build with Visual Studio and a Visual Studio test. So we ran some unit and functional tests, which is great because we want to test our code before it goes into production. And it's effectively copied these files and published it as a build artifact. So I should have a build artifact somewhere, which means I can pull that into our pipeline. Cool. So if I go into that release pipeline, I'm ready to add in our build artifact. So this is the current one we're working on. Let's go to edit here. This is where I add my artifact. Now I can add multiple artifacts. So we just built an artifact. It's this one right here. I know that I have others I could use. So when I add this artifact in, we want to go to the latest version. The source alias is fine. I didn't do anything creative with the naming conventions, but I would always suggest, we are a little bit more creative. Now, a great thing that you can see is you don't always have to do this as an artifact from Azure DevOps. For customers that are using Jenkins or other third-party tools, you have the ability to pull in your Jenkins artifacts into Azure DevOps for your release pipeline. You can pull it in from Azure Artifacts. You can do it from GitHub Releases. You can do it from GitHub itself. So you might have an artifact package somewhere, a build artifact that you want to pull in. But I want to add the one we've just built, so I'm going to add that in. One more thing I'm going to do is I'm going to enable full CICD. So that's my CICD trigger, meaning anytime a new build is available, it will trigger my pipeline to run. Now, I put in these manual controls to help with that. I don't have a schedule, but if that box isn't ticked or this little lightning bolt isn't ticked, we're not going to have it. But again, we find maybe we want to add some tasks in line with some of these other jobs. Maybe we want to do some kind of testing. We can run automated test, or we can do performance testing and deployment testing on top of how we're deploying. And that gives us some really good metrics to run off of. So I'm going to save these changes and we're going to release our pipeline and see what happens, Mert. So while this is running through, we're going to hit it, create a release, and it's going to run. Do you have any questions?
No, one of my questions is, can we use other tests on application delivery? But I think you already show it.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any options? Load testing or something different?
Absolutely. So we can write our tests into YAML and throw it into that build pipeline. We can also run tests into our release pipeline in the environments. The only thing is we want to make sure we're probably doing it with our code early on before it starts getting deployed out. So in that build pipeline, absolutely. So we could add a slew of tests in there. And actually, while this is running, let me open up my build pipelines real quickly. So this is the one that we created just shortly ago. I talked about these tasks being available. So writing in YAML for the first time can be really difficult, to say the least. And if anyone writes code in YAML a lot, knows if you miss a space, it's detrimental to what you're doing. But effectively, we're triggering any merge into our master or main branch is going to trigger this, and it'll kick off our code. So we talked about some tests here. There's a test here. I want to add another test. Now, we want to add it as a task, but I don't know what kind of test I want, or maybe I'm just kind of like, not sure how to write it. I'm going to just see if I can expand this a bit. It's not going to let me expand it. Oops. We have all these tasks here to help you do this. So there's a .NET Core build command here that allows you to do that if you're writing in .NET, but there's tons of other tasks that we can load in. And you can also bring stuff in from the marketplace. So if I just type in test, I can do a test in Go. I can publish our test results. I can do a Visual Studio test. I can do all sorts of testing built in right here. So I like writing things in Go. So I might run, I could run a test command, put in arguments, have the working directory, and it will spit out that YAML for me. So even with the .NET Core stuff, give it the working directory, give the path to the project and arguments, it gives us that YAML. Maybe we want to add another task. Maybe we're running something with Kubernetes. Let's say, updating a Kubernetes cluster today. We have the service connection we need to add in the namespace and all these other things, it spits out that YAML for us. And we literally just need to copy it and then paste it into here. So if we want to add more tests, we can do that. If we want to add a custom test, maybe, you're running kind of some PowerShell code and want to run some pester testing against it, or have custom tests written in Go, you can absolutely import those in.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to check on our release pipeline. So great news. That staging environment ran in a couple minutes. We can see this approval gate here. Before I approve it, Mert, I want to go to our staging environment. So if in case anyone doesn't believe me, I'm going to reopen the link again instead of refreshing the one I had. And what we should have here is a change in our shipping threshold. There we go. Refresh always works. So we have a change right here in the shipping threshold. I talked about before, we're putting this manual check-in. We can be looking for other things. We could be running other tests. I'm happy with the website. Are you happy with it, Mert?
Yes.
Cool.
Perfect.
Let's approve it. Well, it works. It works in staging. What could go wrong, right? So we're going to approve it from the staging environment. It's been deployed there, and it's going to go to Canary now, and it's going to queue for pipeline. So this is going to run on an Azure DevOps hosted agent. It's not running locally in my Azure environment at all, but we can absolutely run it in Azure if we want to. And then we can see the output of any tests we run or anything else. We can use test plans and inject testing into our environment as well with Azure test plans down here. So we can add some of these in, load them in, and then we can see the results as our pipeline's running. So yeah. So we'll let that run. That hopefully only takes a couple minutes. We can see it's already on 3 out of 3 tasks. We'll watch it, see what it does. So in the stages that it's running now of those tasks, it's actually deploying the Azure app service. So it's taking the code we've done and it's sending it through, which is great. So we can also watch the logs. This is a great time when stuff's deploying to maybe go get a cup of coffee or just step away, but it is actually deploying the web app. So we can have a look at it, see what it's actually doing, and it's done. So effectively, this ran in less than a minute, okay? We've updated our website, we've pushed our code, we've ran some tests against it, and we deployed it to Canary. So what I wanna do is find this is our Canary website. So instead of clicking on it, because I feel like I'm cheating when I'm doing that, I'm gonna go to this Canary environment, click on the website here, and it's going to load our website for us. There we go. So we have $250 threshold in our Canary environment. So what have we done? We've created a release pipeline, and see, I don't have to send to production because I would leave it in this state for the bank holiday weekend, because that way we have 2 environments now. So we are testing 2 versions of the exact same version of our website. So we have the $100 shipping threshold and the $250 shipping threshold. And we would leave it like this the entire weekend and let it run. So for those of you watching on StreamYard right now, we have a little bit of audience participation for you. So hang on just one moment while I get this up. If you're watching from home, you can scan this QR code off the screen, and you should have, half of you should have the $100 version of our website, and the other half should have the $250 version. So I would encourage everyone to input into the chat which website version you have, and we'll give you guys a moment or two to load that up, and we can see that. You can try this at home as well, Mert. I might even do it to myself. I'll see which website I get.
Okay, let me try. Okay, I get the $100 version.
I got the $250 version. I'm going to try it again from a different web browser and see if I get a different answer. So the load balancing is a round robin. It's not always perfect. It depends how many people are hitting the server as well. So it can vary quite a bit. So if I refresh my page in this browser, I wonder if I get a different one. So yeah, so this one's hitting the production website, and then the other one's hitting the Canary environment. So cool. All right, Mert. So we have successfully deployed our application with changes to 2 different environments that are completely identical. And we've used a deployment strategy in Azure to do so. And we've put in a full pipeline end to end to make that achievable in the long term.
Thank you very much. It's an awesome demo. And I want to ask a question about the third-party solutions, because you showed all of our Microsoft products. Are there any third-party solutions for application delivery on Azure?
So you can absolutely, I will talk about GitHub Actions because Microsoft now owns that. You can absolutely do this in GitHub Actions. Next week, I will be demoing this live at an event at the Welsh user group. But yes, you can absolutely do this in Actions because it's just a YAML file. So if you can get it working in YAML in Azure DevOps, you can take that pipeline and transform that to GitHub Actions as well. And it's super, super easy to create. So if your code is already sitting in GitHub, you don't have Azure DevOps, or your organization isn't using it, you can absolutely do that from GitHub Actions. It's pretty easy to do. You can also use various other, you can use Jenkins, Octopus, etc. to do this in. But I tend to work in Azure DevOps, my day-to-day job, but also because it's any platform and it's any language. So customers can deploy to Azure. They can deploy to on-premises and AWS or GCP. And I think the reality is a lot of customers sit in multiple places. They don't, not everyone's in the cloud, not everyone's on premises. And there's quite a big hybrid approach. So that tool absolutely allows you to do that.
Thank you. And you showed the IaaS and local environments in the demo. And I want to ask you about the hybrid environments. Can I use this application delivery and these deployments and A/B testing on a hybrid environment?
Absolutely. I think as long as you have configuration on site to do this. So if you have 2 versions of your website running, whether it's, sitting on a cluster of servers or virtual machines on premises, absolutely. I think the big thing about A/B testing, and this is a key part, is getting that identical workload. Because I think the problem a lot of us can say we have is we're running production on like the clean, new, shiny hardware, and then pre-prod or dev or test is sitting on like the dusty corner in the back, and it's the old hardware. It's been repurposed. So you can absolutely do this on premises as well. Things like the Azure web apps are just an easier way to do this, a lot more streamlined, and that's why I love working with them. I go kind of platform as a service, cloud native as much as I can, to avoid the issues of managing a virtual machine, managing an operating system, and managing a firewall. So for deployment strategies, things like your Kubernetes, your web apps, and even virtual machine scale sets just are a lot more. You can make this completely repeatable. And I've done that with customers quite often, where we're building out VM scale sets because something can't be containerized or something can't move to a web app because there's some limitation within the software, the application. So quite often we might use a VM scale set. So yeah, absolutely. And the other thing you can do too in Azure DevOps, and I'll pull up my screen real quickly. Let me move it back over. You can do deployment groups. So when you talked about deploying on premises, I can add a deployment group, and the deployment group might be, we can call it dev. We can have a dev environment, and we can do it per environment. I could do like a SQL environment, etc. And what this allows me to do is it registers a machine or group of machines to this group. So I can then, instead of deploy to a deployment slot, we can change that to a deployment group. So if you are using virtual machines or physical machines, you can do that. So we give the group a name, and maybe we'll call this, the SQL servers or something, right? We can say it's a Windows or a Linux box, etc. Click on Windows. We run this PowerShell script, and it allows us to authenticate to the system. And then any server that has the script ran on it has a secure authentication mechanism to talk back to Azure DevOps. So then instead of deploying a server name and keeping track of the names, using these deployment groups, especially for VMs and physical boxes, we can just do deployment groups. So in this instance, I would do a deployment group and have the same name, maybe like, Canary IIS, or, web. I'd probably call it web. I could have staging web, Canary web, etc. And then if it had a database backend that we had to be concerned about, I'd put those into deployment groups as well, or they could be looped into one. But any effect we make in that pipeline would just be to a deployment group instead of the deployment slots like we did with Azure Web Apps. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
So what challenges may I face when managing application delivery?
Sorry, say that again.
What challenges may I face when managing my application delivery on Azure?
I think, with application delivery, it's much easier in the cloud. I think that's an enablement of the cloud. I think some things that can happen in the cloud, though, is maybe how we scale, and maybe if an application has some very interesting things in it. But when customers are talking about becoming more agile and working in a more DevOps mindset, there's these little things that are available to them. And I say little because they make a big difference to an organization. So I think the challenge is when a customer's like, we want to use all virtual machines, and that's okay. But it is a bit challenging. It's a bit limiting because there's features built into these pre-packaged services. So, I think people need to automate early and often. And that's why we put this into a pipeline and didn't just do a deployment slot, because it's a manual check. And if something were to happen to someone over this bank holiday weekend, you hate to use the phrase hit by a bus, but if you have a single point of failure and that's a human, then that's the biggest issue. Is so if things you can automate early and often, absolutely do that, whether they are virtual machines or you are using platform as a service or software as a service. Automate that stuff as early and often as you can, and I think there'll be a lot more value for people that do that.
Okay, and I think the biggest challenge is using YAML, because it is not easy to use.
Correct.
This is my last question. Are there any best practices?
With YAML or with deployment strategies?
No, YAML with deployment strategy.
With YAML,
have
lots of coffee. Have lots of coffee. No, in all seriousness, when you're use the tools to your advantage. I mean, tooling isn't going to make or break your organization's DevOps strategy, but it's going to make your life easier. So, it's that early autumn, make your life a bit easier as a developer or as an operations person. When I'm writing YAML, I do write it in VS Code, and I have an extension in there to help me find where I've missed a space, literally a space, because I've lost hours of my life to that. And the extensions that allow for the editing have improved massively in the last year or two. So use the tools to your advantage, automate what you can, and I think people talk about, well, it's hard to automate, it's hard to this, and I tell people, think about how often you mistype your own name. I mistype my own name like every day. I can't even type my own name without an error. Forget IP addresses or server names. Anytime you have something that a human can do, a machine should be doing it, right? And so don't be afraid of that. Use the tools to your advantage. Allow that help in there. I've worked with customers that use like Notepad++ to edit, and finding an error in Notepad++ has taken me days, whereas in VS Code, I found it in a matter of minutes. So, use the tools to your advantage, make your life a bit easier, and, keep on automating.
Okay, thank you very much. While waiting questions from the audience, I want to thank you again. It was a great presentation and a great demo. I have learned too much, and hope to see you again in other episodes, maybe next year.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions? No? Do you want to share your social media accounts?
Sure, absolutely. I think anyone watching this, welcome to reach out and ask questions. I don't respond well to email, as Mert has learned. I'm busy, and email is like the black hole of my life. And it's nothing personal. It's just, it's busy. Always reach out to me on Twitter @theAprilEdwards, or LinkedIn as well. Send me a message, follow. I'm always posting stuff about Azure, DevOps, automation stuff as well, and always welcome questions. And I do have a blog, azapril.dev, and I do post stuff on Terraform. I do actually have an article on the A/B testing that we talked about today that you can reference, see the code, and see how it's done as well. So always encourage people to check it out and keep learning.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to say again, it was a great session for me.
Sorry, say that again.
It was a great session for me, and
Good.
I want to thank you again.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was really good. Very, very good, Mert.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
See you. Cheers.